Welcome back to a very brief history of opera. My name is John Andrews, and today in episode 5 we will look at the operatic expression of one of the most powerful forces in the 19th century, nationalism. In the late 19th century, while Wagner and Verdi were dominating the operatic stage, the German symphonic tradition had come to exercise a near monopoly over concert halls. Beethoven, Schubert, Mendelssohn and Brahms had become towering influences. Composers from across Europe went to study in Germany as the symphonic style became accepted as the gold standard of serious musical expression. But even as these giants were bestriding Europe's concert halls, a revulsion was building, not only in those lands that were politically subordinated to Austro-German rule, such as Bohemia, but also in the rising power to the east, Russia. A generation of composers were reaching maturity who wanted to define themselves specifically against German domination. Many went out to the countryside collecting folk music, transcribing it, adding rich harmonizations and publishing these collections for people to play in their homes. And it was only a matter of time before these new melodies, rhythms and colours made their way onto the stage. In Russia, Glinka, Dozhomysky, Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, and in Bohemia, Smetana and Dvorak set out to create opera not merely in their own languages, but in distinct national and local styles, beginning a fracturing of tradition that would only accelerate into the next century. But first, let us turn briefly to the West. Because in Paris, an even older conservatism held sway, whose grip on cultural life would therefore fall all the more dramatically at the beginning of the next century. A couple of decades older than Puccini, the last of the great French romantics was Jules Massenet. After studies with Ambroise Thomas, he wrote 30 operas covering all possible available forms and styles, and although, like everyone in the latter 19th century, he couldn't completely escape the draw of Wagner, fundamentally conservative in approach, his main influence was Gounod. Remaining romantic in outlook, his grasp of drama was exceptional, and his emotional characterization deeply poignant. He's now remembered for two masterpieces, Manon in 1884, which proved his most popular success, especially in France, and Werther in 1892, on which his critical reputation stands. Jokes that England in this period was a land without music are a deeply unfair caricature. The great choral festivals in Leeds and Birmingham in particular attracted the greatest composers of the age, and London, as ever, imported operas from across Europe, but it is certainly true that enthusiasm for native talent was lukewarm, to say the least. In the early 19th century, only Michael Balfe secured an international reputation, although Macfarren and Wallace both achieved domestic popularity. In the latter years of the century, Arthur Sullivan dominated the London musical scene. But despite the huge success of his early dramatic oratorios and his incidental music for the theatre, the commercial popularity of his Savoy operas came at the price of what he saw as his more serious work. And yet, in these operas, the combination of his unforced lyricism, crystalline orchestration, and warm heart, often in glorious tension with Gilbert's dark cynicism, proved a magical and enduring combination. Not unlike London, St. Petersburg had traditionally preferred, where at all possible, to buy the best foreign composers. At the time of his death, Mozart was being actively pursued to take up a post there, whilst Paisiello enjoyed 8 years serving Catherine the Great, for whose court he composed The Barber of Seville. But Russia had, since the reforms of Peter the Great in the 17th century, always had one foot in the west, often symbolised by his new capital in St. Petersburg, and one in the east, the old Muscovy that lived in Russia's traditional past of religious orthodoxy and political absolutism. And by the late 19th century, a real fissure was opening up between these two senses of Russian identity as they were expressed in the arts. And Russia's cultural institutions, most notably the St. Petersburg and Moscow conservatoires, remained rooted in the Western attitude that European music, and specifically the German symphonic form, was the apex of musical sophistication. But a real sense of pride in older native traditions was bubbling up to the surface, and in the middle of the century, two composers would light the way to a distinctively Russian approach to music and to opera in particular, Mikhail Ivanovich Glinka and Alexander Dozhominsky. Glinka had returned from studies in Italy to write two hugely influential operas. A Life for the Tsar in 1836 was a patriotic epic, whilst Ruslan and Lyudmilla was based on a story by Russia's greatest poet, Pushkin. Although Glinka's musical style owed much to that of his Italian contemporaries, Donizetti in particular, his influence on those who followed him was profound. Firstly, by writing in Russian, he demonstrated the wonderful suitability of that language with its rich open vowels for operatic expression. Secondly, his use of genuine folk melodies showed how popular traditional musical forms could give a national colour to music. And finally, his choice of a patriotic storyline showed how opera could be part of the retelling of a national history. After his death in 1857, his name was given to 3 conservatoires and a composition prize. He was the hero of the generation of composers who came after him.
Бедный конь в поле пал, я бегом добежал, вот и наш посад. Должен Минин узнать, что враги подошли, у ворот стоят. За стеной тишина, весь посад крепко спит, достучусь ли я?
But possibly even more influential on the development of a genuinely Russian musical language, his younger colleague Dozhominsky is one of those composers whose role in musical history is profound, despite the paucity of his own output. He was a true believer that singing, in opera in particular, should absolutely match the natural rhythms and inflections of the spoken language. Just as it stands, he said, so that the inner truth of the text should not be distorted. And he set out to make this a reality in Russian. In his opera, The Stone Guest, a version of the Don Giovanni story, he eschewed aria forms and instead developed a free recitative arioso approach, which mirrored the aims absolutely of those original Florentine scholars, but this time rooted completely and absolutely in the cadence of the Russian language itself. His mantle, and indeed the literal task of completing his unfinished opera, fell to a group of 5 composers who came together in St. Petersburg in the 1860s, determined to create a specifically Russian music. Led by Mili Balakirev, the mighty handful, as they were known, also comprised Kui, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, and most influentially for Russian opera, Modest Mussorgsky. all of the Russian composers who shunned the conservatoires, he had to earn his money in other ways, and Mussorgsky initially joined the army. But in 1856 he met Alexander Borodin, and through him Darzymiński. Darzymiński's influence on Mussorgsky was huge, and the younger composer went on then to study with Balakirev, absorbing music from a wide and catholic range of European contemporaries: Schumann, Schubert, Glinka, Verdi, but deliberately eschewing the rigour of a conservatoire training and the conservatism that might bring. So his music, and his harmony in particular, is brilliantly experimental. His song cycles, Sunless and Songs of Dancers of Death, with their use of harmony as colour rather than functional progression, were to be a profound influence on Debussy, and his piano suite, Pictures and Exhibition, has also proved fantastically popular. But it's his operas, Boris Godunov and Khovanshchina, that are his greatest achievement. Unfortunately, Mussorgsky's taste for strong drink, developed in his army days, turned into full-blooded alcoholism after the death of his mother, and Khovanshchina was left unfinished, along with many of his other works. In the decades after his death, his more conservative and cautious colleague, Rimsky-Korsakov, who of course composed some notable operas of his own, prepared performing versions of Mussorgsky's work which toned down the roughness and rawness of his harmonies and orchestration in order to make them palatable to contemporary audiences. But in the 20th century, his originality and raw energy were rediscovered and came to be venerated by a generation of Russian composers, including Shostakovich. And it's precisely this raw, rough directness and combination of dramatic recitative and Slavic lyricism that make them so very popular today. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Russia, regarded as too Germanic by nationalists and too gauchily Russian by the establishment, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky seemed destined to please nobody. Except, fortunately for us, audiences. In a life as dramatic as many opera plots, Tchaikovsky struggled with demons both internal and external, but few composers of his generation have achieved such widespread popularity. His operas are perhaps not as well known as his symphonies or ballets, but of the 11 that he wrote, Eugene Onegin in 1874 and The Queen of Spades in 1890 contain some of the most beautiful music, heartbreaking tragedy and psychological insight of anything on stage. In contrast to Russia, which was becoming a world power, the revolt against German musical hegemony in Bohemia was born of political and cultural subjugation. Part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for centuries, the Czech lands remained under imperial rule, and although the Emperor Joseph II's attempts to eradicate internal national identities and cultures had foundered, the language of government and business in Prague was still German, as it had been during Mozart's triumphant visits in the 1780s. But Bohemia was a country with a rich folk heritage, both in poetry and music, and that heritage would feed the inspiration of two very contrasting composers, Bedřich Smetana and Antonín Dvořák. It may be no coincidence that the more self-consciously nationalist of the two, Smetana, actually grew up speaking German, and he had to teach himself Czech as an adult. His political radicalism was fired by the Prague Uprising in 1848 when he was in his early 20s. He spent the next decade in Sweden, but returned in the 1860s and set out to create a distinctively Czech sound world. His symphonic cycle, Ma Vlast, and his opera The Bartered Bride would leave a lasting legacy before political disagreements and rapidly failing health ended his career. By contrast, his younger colleague Antonín Dvořák was an adoring disciple of Johannes Brahms. And yet, despite this less self-conscious mission, his fascination with the grisly fairy tales of his native land and the folk music of rural Bohemia meant that his work seemed to embody the Czech countryside with a power and immediacy that springs instantly to life, and he was quickly feted across the drawing rooms and concert halls of Europe. Although known best now for his symphonies, Dvořák wrote 9 operas, all rooted in the folk traditions of Bohemia, all combining the Czech language with a musical style first rooted in that of Meyerbeer and Rossini that he'd played in the Prague Theatre Orchestra, later absorbing that of Wagner. His most famous opera, Rusalka, tells of a water nymph who trades her voice for the ability to follow her beloved onto land. A less likely biography of an opera composer could hardly be imagined than that of their younger colleague Leos Janacek. For the first 40 years of his life, he was mainly engaged in folklore research, and like many nationalistically inclined composers of the period, he was deeply interested in synthesizing the natural speech rhythms of his native language. In Janacek's case, he did this with music directly inspired by genuine folk traditions, whilst 19th century folklorists like Rimsky-Korsakov had transcribed traditional songs and then accommodated them to a regular-ish meter, key signature and conventional romantic harmonies. Their 20th century successors, such as Janacek and, in Hungary, Béla Bartók, armed with recording equipment, were able to capture with total fidelity the rhythmic complexities and irregularities of traditional music and the authentic accompaniments of drones, drumming and complicated heterophony. Janacek wrote his first opera, Jennifer, in 1904 when he was already 50, and it wasn't performed until 12 years later, in 1916, in Prague, where it was an immediate overnight success. And in the last 10 years of his life, he produced 4 of the most enduring classics of the 20th century opera stage: Katia Kabonova, The Cunning Little Vixen, The Macropolis Case, and From the House of the Dead. In these he obsessively synthesised natural speech rhythms with both Romanticism and Czech folk traditions in a spare, near-minimalist style. He famously made his own manuscript paper and never wrote the stave until he knew he had something to put there, just in case he was tempted to write unnecessary notes. Using a modal language that reflected ancient tradition rather than modern key signatures, it's hard to think of another composer except perhaps Mozart who achieved such a consistency of success in so few works. And in Janacek we have a vital bridge into the cataclysmic events of the 20th century, which is where we shall conclude this particular story in our next episode.